Father, thank you that we could be here this day. I ask, Lord, that you please just be with us as we look at the book of Job, Lord. There are people going through intense suffering in our community, in our lives, maybe some of us. And so may these words not ring hollow. May they be helpful, Lord, even as we consider the challenges and the darkness around us. Be with us, Lord, in your name. Amen. So we did take a 1-week hiatus from the book of Job, and we're back into it, and we will be in it until Thanksgiving, which will give us a reason for giving thanks, because the book of Job is about suffering and how we make sense of suffering. And even if we may find the material helpful, or we may find the material something that at some point we will apply, it's learning one of those things that you really don't want to apply. You know, whatever we learn from the book of Job, whatever we learn about suffering or evil, we don't really want to know it. We hope we never have to use the information. In the book, we're introduced to a man named Job. He's exceedingly righteous, exceedingly prosperous, and then he goes through extreme suffering and loses everything he has, his property, his family, and eventually his health. And the rest of the story is Job trying to make sense of that suffering along with his three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. The key to understanding Job's story is that as the reader, we're given a glimpse into what's happening in the council room of God, where this adversary, this challenger comes up and says, have you considered Job? And God says to the adversary, rather, have you considered Job? He's blameless and upright, somebody who fears God and shuns evil. So we know from the get-go that Job is righteous, declared so by God, and there's no earthly reason that what's about to happen to him will happen to him. There's no obvious explanation. But the book is about his friends trying to come up with an obvious explanation according to what we call the retribution policy, which is that the righteous will prosper and the wicked will suffer. So that's really what's being challenged, is the adversary is challenging God and saying this policy doesn't really work because somebody could be prosperous and so they're only righteous in order to be prosperous, or somebody is afraid of suffering and so that's why they're just avoiding wickedness. And so God says, all right, bring it on, and he accepts the challenge. And so all throughout the book of Job, God is on trial, Job is not on trial, but his friends want Job to be on trial. They keep saying to Job, it's actually your fault. Because you've suffered according to the retribution policy, that must mean you're wicked, and so therefore the fault of this lies with you. And so at this point, each of them has had a chance to speak. Job has responded to each of them. And so today, we'll see that his friends double down. Eliphaz begins by doubling down. He begins by saying, you're the problem. And Job's going to respond. Now, much of what Eliphaz and we'll see Bildad say today is just a rehashing of what they've already said. So we're not going to spend as much time on it, but we have to see that they just keep going back to the old well. This is your fault. So they say Job is the problem. Job 15, verse 2, should a wise man answer with windy knowledge and fill his belly with the east wind? In other words, this is again, whenever you see somebody compare your words to wind, they're saying you're full of hot air. That's what the wisdom literature is doing. Nothing you say makes sense. Eliphaz goes on to say that Job has forsaken the fear of God, that his own words condemn him as a result. Because Job keeps saying that he is upright, and therefore God must have reasons other than the retribution policy, Eliphaz says, not only are you guilty, but you're stupid. Verse 8, 15 verse 8, have you listened in the counsel of God? And do you limit your wisdom to yourself? Now, again, we the reader have listened into the council room of God. And we know that Eliphaz doesn't know that, neither does Job, but we know that God has declared Job righteous. But Eliphaz is saying, even if Job did have access, he discovered that there was no one to defend him, which again, we know is false. Eliphaz is out of line. He goes on to compare Job to a wicked man who is afraid of God's judgment in the midst of prosperity. Job 15:20. The wicked man rise in pain all his days. Through all the years that are laid up for the ruthless, dreadful sounds are in his ears. In prosperity, the destroyer will come upon him. In other words, he's afraid of, even though he was prosperous, he's like a prosperous man who's afraid of death because he knows he's actually wicked. He goes on to say in 15:27 that Job was like a wicked man because he has covered his face with his fat and gathered fat upon his waist. To be fat was to have to be comfortable, right? It was a symbol of prosperity. So he's saying, because you're like a guy who lives because of the fat, the extra that you have, the prosperity that you have, and it's just causing you to hide behind all of that prosperity, and what it's really hiding is your own pride. And so that's the accusation that he's making against Job. Job's pride is the thing that is implicating him in his wickedness. So Job responds to Eliphaz and basically says, you are the worst. You're the worst, which he kind of is. Job says in 16:2, I've heard many such things. Miserable comforters are you all. He goes on to say, if I were in your position, I could say the same things to you. I could tell you about how it was your own sin. I could make things worse for you the way you're doing for me by blaming me. But what good does it do if I defend myself? He says that far from being like the wicked man who's hiding behind his own fat, actually in 16 verse 8, he says that God has made him lean. God has shriveled him up. It's a witness against him. His leanness has risen up against him. It testifies to his face. He's saying that his words aren't even necessary. He goes, I don't have to say anything to defend myself. What can I say anyway? Here I am, sitting in disfigured on a pile of ashes with nothing left around me. I don't have the strength to eat. I've lost whatever fat I had on my body. So I'm not hiding myself behind my prosperity. God has made me lean. Everywhere I go, people gape at me. They look at me. His own friends are coming against him. They wonder what Job must have done. Even though Job knows that he's not actually guilty, his circumstances make it look like he is, like he has somehow deserved everything that has come upon him. But he continues to defend his own integrity. He says, well, it was God who's done this, and it's only God who can argue my case. In 16 verse 20, he says, my friends scorn me. My eyes pour out tears to God, that he would argue the case of a man with God as a son of man does with his neighbor. He's living in this tension of knowing that God has done it. Right, again, we've said from the beginning, Job never makes any claim other than that God is ultimately behind this. But he says, even though he knows God has done this, he also knows that the only one who can vindicate him, the only mediator, is actually also God. And so he says in 17:5 to his friends that they're standing on dangerous ground. Because he who informs against his friends to get a share of their property, the eyes of his children will fail. In other words, if you are bringing an accusation against me, you need to be careful lest you not stand up to the very judgment that you're bringing yourselves. If you are bearing false witness about me before God, which you are, then it will bring destruction on you and your family. And this is a principle that we read, and we actually looked at this when we looked at the Ten Commandments and looked at, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor, false testimony. Because when Moses explains that more in Deuteronomy 19, what he says is, if a malicious witness arises to accuse a person of wrongdoing, then both parties to the dispute shall appear before the Lord, before the priests and the judges who are in office in those days. The judges shall inquire diligently, and if the witness is a false witness and has accused his brother falsely, then you shall do to him as he had meant to do to his brother. In other words, if you bring false testimony against somebody expecting that they will receive judgment, and it's discovered that you have brought that false testimony, then you will be subject to the same judgment that you brought against them. This is what Job is getting at. He's saying, if you're going to accuse me of wrongdoing falsely in front of God, so that what you're saying, that what has come upon me is God's judgment, then you better be careful because you have reason to fear. And in the New Testament, Jesus says it in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 7, judge not that you not be judged. For with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do we stand in the judgment seat on those going through suffering? If you're going to go out and start making judgment calls about someone else's fear of God, which is what Eliphaz does, we better be prepared for the retribution that might come against us if we are wrong. Why are we making those calls? Eliphaz and the others don't have the grounds to make an accusation against him. They aren't God. They don't know. They can't speak for God. So this is when Bildad goes, all right, how about I double down? I want to remind you that you're being punished. Bildad apparently remembers what Job had said to his friends. If you remember, Job said, like, if you want wisdom, why don't you go ask your goldfish? Why don't you go ask your dog? Why don't you go ask your plants? Because all of those know more than you. Well, it stuck with Bildad because he asks right off the bat in 18:3, why are we counted as cattle? Why are we stupid in your sight? To which Job is like, well, at least you listen to something, you moron. Like, thank goodness you heard me. That's exactly what I meant. Bildad goes on to describe the wicked man who receives the punishment of God in verse 18. He is thrust from light into darkness. He's driven out of the world. He has no posterity or progeny among his people, and no survivor where he used to live. They of the west are appalled at his day, and horror seizes them of the east. Surely such are the dwellings of the unrighteous, such is the place of him who knows not God. Look at what's happening to you. The problem is that you don't know God. Even when this suffering came upon you, you have no possessions, you have no offspring. Everyone who sees you is disgusted by you. Everyone who sees you is appalled. And that's the place of the unrighteous. That's where the unrighteous live, those who do not know God. And Bildad says that's Job. So Job responds to his friends, part one, you should be ashamed. I want you to consider the scenario that's playing out in the story, because here you have a guy who's lost everything on one fateful night. Everything he has is gone. The only person left with him is his wife, and if you remember, his wife is like, why don't you just give up? And if we take the account literally, Job might have 4 servants left, the 4 servants who told him that everything else was wiped out. Then Job is afflicted with sores all over his body, so that when his friends show up, they don't even recognize him. He's gone through the worst possible calamity that you can imagine. And after a short time of sitting with Job and his sufferings, his friends, so-called friends, get up to help him understand what's going on. And the first thing they said is, you know what? This is your fault. You've done this. You need to repent. You are the one who's wicked. They say you're too stupid to see it. Repent from whatever it is that you did and accept the fact that you brought this calamity on yourself. And Job's response is, why would you make this worse by placing the blame on me? Why do you even think you have the authority to do that? In Job 19, verse 1, he says, then Job answered and said, how long will you torment me and break me in pieces with words? These 10 times you have cast reproach upon me. Are you not ashamed to wrong me? And even if it be true that I've erred, my error remains with myself. If indeed you magnify yourselves against me and make my disgrace an argument against me, know then that God has put me in the wrong and closed his net about me. He's saying, even if what you're saying about me is true, it's an issue between me and God. Like, what gives you the authority to decide what it is that I've done wrong or even whether or not I have? You're using the disgrace that I faced and you're turning it against me when what you should be doing is asking the same questions that I am about God. Everything you thought you knew about why suffering comes, everything you thought you knew about prosperity has been upended. So instead of trying to interpret what I'm going through your outdated thinking, why don't you, with me, reevaluate what we think about God? Job is coming around to what we, the reader, have known since the beginning, which again is that Job is not on trial. God is on trial. And even if it were true that God had some case against Job, which he doesn't, but even if he did, that's between God and Job. Why are you stepping into it and pronouncing judgment? The problem is, we do this all the time. Whether we do it or those who claim to represent us do it. I can remember multiple times in my life where tragic things happened, and immediately some Christian figurehead went to go blame the people of the city, the people who suffered with whatever sin it was they wanted to insert. A gay nightclub gets shot up, and some Christian somewhere says, well, they deserved it. That was God's judgment. Of course, nobody says that after a school shooting, except to blame maybe an area of the country whose gun laws are too lax. We beat ourselves up when something goes wrong in our own life. I know that I've done it. Something bad happens, and I think, well, if only I would have made better choices or different choices. Or sometimes something good happens, and I think, well, I didn't deserve this. I'm too wicked for this good thing to have happened. That's not to say that there aren't consequences to our actions. Of course there are, right? Like there are consequences to failed gun law. There's consequences to unhealthy dietary habits. There's consequences to everything that we do. But there is a difference between natural consequences and the judgment of God. And sometimes the connections we try to make aren't there at all. A lot of people get cancer because of unhealthy habits. But a lot of people who have unhealthy habits never get cancer. And a lot of healthy people get cancer for no reason. There's no connection that we want to make. I mean, we know that, sure, we can increase our risk levels and there are things that lead to certain other things. But like, you know, when we want to step in and pronounce judgment, we're talking about things that we really have no knowledge of. What Job is getting at and his friends are missing is that trying to make connections to what God is doing is a dangerous game. You don't have the information you need. You might be able to say, well, maybe there's these things, maybe there's these risks, maybe there's these natural consequences, but you don't really know. You have no idea. Judgment only ever leads to loneliness for the sufferer. It only ever leads to the loneliness of the sufferer who's left to deal with their own pain, and we're just piling it on. This is why Job says that what used to feel like a hedge of protection around him now feels like an oppressive prison in 19:8. God has walled up my way so that I cannot pass, and he set darkness upon my paths. He wants clarity, but all he has is darkness. And then he says, he's going to go on to say, not only has God given me nothing but darkness, but my friends who are supposed to be here with me, who may have been able to shed or be at least the glimmer of light in the darkness, they've all left me too. So now I have nothing but darkness. The final thing, and this is so important, the final tragedy and the final thing taken from Job, it wasn't his possessions, it wasn't his family, it wasn't his health, it's actually his community. Job 19:17, my breath is strange to my wife. I am a stench to the children of my own mother. Even young children despise me. When I rise, they talk against me. All my intimate friends abhor me, and those whom I loved have turned against me. Job is describing and feeling something that happens all the time when people go through difficult times, even joyful ones, if we're being honest. I mean, there's a lot of things, everyone shows up when things happen, and then after a time, they all tend to leave, and we're kind of left to just go through it. You could think about this in good times, right? Like when you have a baby, you have a baby, everyone wants to see the newborn baby, because newborn babies are adorable, and you hold them, and they don't do anything, and they just sit there, and you just go, oh, this is so cute, and it just sleeps, and then you hand it back to the mother, and you're like, man, this is awesome, thanks for letting me see the baby. But you don't need help when you have a newborn baby, not when you're in the hospital, not even really the first couple weeks when the baby mostly sleeps, the vast majority of babies, not every baby, but most babies just like they sleep for most of the time. It's like 3 or 4 weeks later when mom is strung out, because she's not getting any sleep because she's breastfeeding the baby, and dad is at the end of his rope, and the baby's not sleeping, and the older kids are having a problem with it. That's when you need help, but nobody shows up, or few people show up. Give it a couple months, and when you actually need comfort, a lot of times, no one is there. And that happens in suffering as well. If you ever had a family member pass away, if you've ever gone through an immediate moment of suffering, everyone shows up at the visitation and the memorial service. But what happens when a couple weeks or a month later, when you start to feel the pain of the loss and you feel the emptiness of the position that person occupied in your life? Where is everybody? Where have they been? Is your community still around you then? Job is begging for his friends to still be there and to be comforters to him. Job 19, verse 20, my bones stick to my skin and to my flesh, and I've escaped by the skin of my teeth. Which we still use that phrase in English. That's where it comes from. Have mercy on me, O you, my friends, for the hand of God has touched me. Why do you, like God, pursue me? Why are you not satisfied with my flesh? He's begging his friends, look, why don't you just accept that for reasons I don't understand, God's hand is turned against me, and then just have mercy? Why are you coming at me with accusations? Why are you effectively leaving me to suffer alone? I have barely escaped death, and now you are doing the very thing that it seems God has done, turned against me. But Job has not lost hope. And here's what he concludes with his second response, Job's response. I know my Redeemer lives. This is one of the most powerful passages in the whole book of Job, and really makes up in many ways Job's central declaration of what he believes. Job 19:23. Oh, that my words were written. Oh, that they were inscribed in a book. Oh, that with an iron pen and lead they were engraved in the rock forever. For I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has been thus destroyed, yet in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see for myself, and my eyes shall behold and not another. My heart faints within me. If you say, how we will pursue him, and the root of the matter is found in him, be afraid of the sword, for wrath brings the punishment of the sword, that you may know there is a judgment. Job says 3 things in this concluding passage. First, that his words were written. Now, this is, Job knows that he is going to die. In fact, he welcomes it, as we've seen over and over, but he's so confident in his own integrity and eventual vindication that even if it doesn't come before his own death, he wants his words to be written down. He says, I'm so confident in my own integrity that I want everything that I said. You can go back a slide, James. He wants everything that he said to be written down, because he wants people to know that even if he dies, he stands on his own integrity. He stands on the things that he believes. He stands on his righteousness. Long after I'm gone, the story that I want told is the one where I held fast my integrity even though God slayed me. The one where even though God had turned against me, I believed he would vindicate me. And of course, we, the reader, know that Job's words were written down, right? This is Job saying in the book of Job, I wish that my words were written down, and we're reading them. Second, Job says that his Redeemer lives. Now, the word that's used for Redeemer here is really the word that's related to the phrase used in the book of Esther, kinsman redeemer. If you remember the book of Ruth, it's about a woman named Ruth who's a Moabite, and her husband dies, which essentially leaves her with nothing. She had no means of earning. She had no children. She had no one to take care of her, no father, because she left her family. But according to the law of God, the closest relative that could marry her and bring her into her family was known as the kinsman redeemer. And a kinsman redeemer would be somebody who's your kinsman, and they would redeem you from this fate of having nothing by marrying you and thus establishing the fortunes of their kinsman, the husband, or whatever. So they would restore the fortunes of this person. Somebody else in the family, another kinsman, would redeem you. And so in Ruth, we know that to be Boaz. But there's a difference. Ruth was not an Israelite. She was a Moabite. She married into the family. So she's part of the family, but she's essentially, socially rejected because of her husband's death. And now she has to be redeemed back into the family by a far-off kinsman who comes to her rescue. But she's outside of the family to begin with. But in the book of Job, Job is referencing God himself as the kinsman redeemer. It's not being used as an actual kinsman. It's being used in relation to God. But what he's saying is that in this case, the person who created the social rejection is also the one who's got to redeem him. That's not the case in the book of Job. Her husband, by virtue of his death, causes her social rejection. In Boaz, someone else has to come in. In the book of Job, Job's living in this tension of saying, my Redeemer is both the one who provided this rejection and must also bring me my redemption. It's one and the same person. The very same person that brought about the suffering to Job's life will also be the very one that will redeem his fortunes. And so no matter what else happened to Job, he's not lost confidence in that redemption. He prays for it to happen in the flesh, but if not, he has confidence that he will be vindicated by his Redeemer. And then finally, he says that if my friends start accusing me and they keep doing this, it is them that should be worried about judgment. He says, if you continue to come at me saying how we will pursue him, and the root of the matter is found in you, then you need to be afraid, because the wrath that brings about the judgment of the sword, that brings about the punishment of the sword, and you will know that there is a judgment. And there's a double thing of him saying that what he's saying is that you may know there's a judgment, in that I will be declared righteous, Job's will be vindicated by that judgment, but also that you will be declared wicked because of the way that you are bringing these accusations against me, who's blameless and upright. If Job's friends insist on placing the blame on Job, then they need to pray that judgment doesn't come on them. So the question is, as we've done every time, is what are we supposed to take away from this when we face suffering? Because one thing that I've already mentioned is that early on in the series is that when a person endures suffering, doesn't need accusation, they need comfort. That what they need is community. And so earlier in the series, we talked about how when you enter into a period of suffering, what you think about God is going to be determined by what you've been dwelling on before you face the suffering. So whatever you think about God before suffering hits is going to form the foundation of what you think about God when you face suffering. What we think about God now is going to form the foundation for what we think about God then. The same can be said of community. We really need community when we're going. We need comfort. We don't need accusation. We need this community. And a lot of people go through life assuming they don't need community until they actually need it. Just like a lot of people don't think a lot about God until they're forced to think a lot about God. They don't think they need community until they really need it. And once they really need it, they discover they don't have it. If you don't have a community of people that you know are your ride or die sort of community, the type of people that are going to be with you no matter how badly you actually do screw up or no matter how badly your life gets, I'm telling you, you need to find that now. you need to find it quickly because you don't know when you'll need it. And before you start thinking that finding community requires people who are going to love you, because that's where we start, we go, okay, so I have to find it. What I hear you saying, Jeremy, is that I need to find a type of community of people who will love me. No, what I'm saying to you is that if you want to find that type of community, you need to be the type of person that loves others. You need to be the type of person that's willing to be that for somebody else. If you want that type of community that will love you when things go bad, you need to start by being that sort of community for someone else. If you've been looking for community and you haven't found it, the first question to ask is, what are you doing for others that shows that you love them? Because I will tell you that most people, in my experience, there are times where somebody struggles with this and they don't get invited into a community, or a community that is really close is very closed off to others, and so it's difficult to break in. But I will tell you that the majority of the time, when somebody doesn't have community around them, it's because they don't actually love others the way they want to be loved. Community happens when you make the first move. But the reason you don't do that is because if you go love others, it means that your efforts to love others could be rejected. That's what makes it hard. I'd rather go into a situation where I know you already love me in advance, and then I feel like, well, I can love you. So we wait for others to love us and to be a community to us, but we aren't willing to make the effort to reciprocate or go out on a ledge ourselves to start the process. But the message of the gospel is not that Jesus waited for us to love him because he was concerned that if he loved us, he might be rejected. The message of the gospel is that he forms community with us and with God when we were still his enemies, and he knew we would reject him, and yet he comes and loves us anyway so that we actually have the capacity to reciprocate. You're not going to get that type of community by sitting around going, why doesn't anybody love me? You're going to get that type of community when you ask yourself, who do I love? Who do I love? Who am I willing to be there for when things really get bad? When the poop hits the fan? Am I going to be the type of person that's standing there with them in it, or am I going to run? Because most of the time, if you want to find community, you'll begin to find it when you have that same sort of self-giving love towards others that Christ has to you. But I will tell you, it's going to hurt. It's going to be hard. It's hard because you will be rejected. It's hard because sometimes you will feel like you are giving more than the other people in your community are giving. And that sucks. But whatever pain it takes to form that community, whatever inconvenience it takes to establish those sorts of relationships is going to seem like nothing when compared to the joy of having people around you when you are suffering. Do you have people who you will go to the ends of the earth with? Do you have people who will walk with even when you know it's them that are screwing up? Like that you'll go, yeah, you really blew it. What's the next step on the journey? I mean, do you have friends, people around you that you pour into that way? Because it's easy for us to ask, well, does anybody love me that way? It's a lot harder to ask yourself the question, do you love anybody that way? But there's a second thing that we can learn. The first is that we have to pour into this community, but the second thing is this, and I don't want to downplay this point. And this is the hope of future vindication does not rid us of the pain of suffering now. This is one of the slippery slopes we get into as Christians, and I'd say maybe the biggest when it comes to suffering, is that because we know that our resurrection is on the horizon, we tend to diminish the pain of our suffering now. Or we end up dismissing it. And we've talked about that at a few points throughout this series. But our problem ultimately flows from a view of the resurrection and the cross. See, because we know about the resurrection that happens on Easter, we tend to think that it in some way balances the scales from Friday. And that's how we think about like our future resurrection. We think about what's on the horizon. Well, that will balance the scales to what's happening now. So we sort of think that, well, there's a horror that leads to the necessity of Easter. And with the knowledge of the resurrection, we come back to Good Friday and we go, okay, well, the cross was good. We think of the cross and what Jesus endures is good. Or we think of the cross as beautiful, or Jesus' suffering is beautiful, because how much more will our future resurrection make our current suffering look good too? Like if Jesus' future resurrection makes even the cross look good, then surely our own future resurrection will even make this suffering look like beautiful in the plans of God. It leads to this place where we think that the future light somehow requires the current darkness of suffering. And this is kind of what Job's friends are doing, because they're calling for Job's repentance, because they see Job's suffering through a lens like this. Job has sinned, therefore, Job is punished. Therefore, Job repents or should repent. Therefore, Job will be restored. And through that matrix or through that lens, they think once you're at the restored position, you're going to look back and you're going to be like, thank God that he punished me. Thank God that he brought all this suffering upon me, because I never would have understood the light had I not gone through the darkness. And that's the way his friends are framing it. But when you look at suffering that way, and when you look at the cross and the resurrection that way, you are coming dangerously close to making God a sadist. As if he has some sort of sadistic mentality relating to his own son. As if in hindsight, the worst form of horror that could be brought upon an innocent person was a good thing in the long run. We make Jesus' suffering a good thing. Like, oh, well, it's all in the plans of God. And we diminish the horror. Or in our own sufferings, if we can hold out long enough, we think eventually we'll see them as good, which is not what Job does. He lives in the tension of saying, I know there will be a redemption of my own name in the end because I'm holding on to my integrity. Unless God himself comes down and tells me why I deserve this, I will hold on to my righteousness, but that doesn't make what he has gone through any better or all of a sudden good. It's still horrible. It's suffering. It's the absence of God that Job is experiencing. And we know, and you know if you've gone through suffering, that there can be things that come out of it that you look back on and go, boy, I really, we leave suffering behind, and maybe we remember the way that we felt and God's protection and a certain intimacy with God in those moments, even if we don't want the circumstances that God brought about to bring them. But that's just sentimentality. That's just how you feel. That doesn't actually make evil good, and it doesn't make suffering better. It flows from an incorrect view of the resurrection and the cross. The future resurrection and our eventual vindication and Job's doesn't make our suffering good. It just makes it more stark. Jeremy Begbie, in a book called A Peculiar Orthodoxy, says it this way. The resurrection does not erase the memory of Friday. It confirms the cross as the focused place where the weight of the world's evil is borne and borne away. This is how God disarms the principalities and powers and triumphs over them. This is how God's idiocy outstrips human wisdom. This is how it is finished. The scandal is captured with astonishing power in Rembrandt's etching The Three Crosses, where the divine light beam falling from above does nothing to alleviate the horror, but rather renders it all the harsher. Easter does, of course, throw its light on Friday, but not a soothing glow so much as a white light that exposes the rupture between creator and creature, the depths to which the human creature has sunk and the depths to which God's love is prepared to reach. This is something like what Job is saying to his friends. I believe I will be vindicated, but it will have to come from the same hand as the one who afflicted me. Does it make sense of our suffering? Does it provide answers? Does V-Day make D-Day look good? Does it alleviate the horror? Or does it just shed a light onto how dark and disturbing and disgusting the rupture between God and his creation actually is? It doesn't make sense. It doesn't provide answers. If anything, it just makes it more stark. But there's hope. And the hope is not that when we are in the darkest moments, even when we feel like it's our relationship with God that's been ruptured, that the light will make the darkness brighter or the evil good. That's not the hope. The hope is that the light of the resurrection will show us the depth to which God's love is prepared to reach. If God is willing that I should experience this darkness, then I can also know that this is how far he is willing to go with me. He doesn't send us into the dark forest on our own. He only goes where he's willing to walk with us. That's what Job knows, and that's what gives him and us our hope. And that's the gospel. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your servant Job, the author of the book of Job. Lord, the example of Job, these questions, that we can wrestle with what suffering looks like, Lord, and where we can find hope and where we can find promise, even in the darkest times. Be with us, Lord, in all that we do. In your name.